Before I start, let me say that I think the system should be publicly owned and run at cost. But there's a constant in people's reaction. They don't understand why the government would have a system that doesn't incentivize conservation. The reason is that Ontario has an almost entirely clean and fully renewable grid from a combination of hydro, solar, and wind, mostly. We have something like 5% on natural gas still, and we've completely phased out coal. Our government has already put the infrastructure in place. We could have transitioned quite some time ago if people understood the facts on the ground. But instead people want to conserve because it's drilled into their heads, mostly by American media. But the real way to break through this confusing set of contradictions is to come to the following conclusion. A market for electricity is impossible. See, that's the scam here. It's the thing that needs to be abolished. You can't turn the hydro off, and you can't store the solar or the wind, so generation costs are static. That is, they're not determined by demand. They're not altered by demand either. So you literally can't conserve. And you can't reduce demand either. So you can't adjust the supply. As costs are always the same, conserving energy just creates debt that needs to be recouped over the next season. What then does it mean to say that there are market rates? It doesn't mean anything at all. It means to say that the producers can arbitrarily rip you off. There can't actually be a market because there can't be any real adjustment. That's what a market is. And it's possible. If you live in Ontario and you're just cluing into this now, you should be absolutely livid because they've been pushing this down on us for 20 years. They told us it would decrease costs. Like they told us it would trickle down. Not many people understood. Okay, many people tried to explain, but the argument keeps getting lost. To this day, there's still millions of Ontarians that think that markets reduce costs. The solution is that we need to cut our losses and renationalize the grid and make sure we're not so foolish to fall for these scam artists the second time. It's the perfect example of why market theory doesn't work. Right? In the meantime, go ahead, waste as much electricity as you want. It's clean. It's renewable. We literally can't get rid of it fast enough. And go ahead, get an electric car already. The system is there for it. It was built for it. You're supposed to be tapping into it. Short of nationalization, the only way that rates will stop hiking every few months is if the utility companies can actually sell enough electricity to generate a profit. So what happened? Well, not quite 10 years ago, but more than 5 years ago, the provincial government in Ontario went on a rampage for green energy. Now, it's a complicated thing, of course. We have to go back a little bit. There was I think it was 2005, there were blackouts in Ontario as a consequence. Of the air conditioners on the grid just nailing it. We had a really, really hot summer that year. It was just humidity with no end in sight kind of thing. I mean, if you lived in California, it would have been, but I mean, we had a California-like summer that year. And the system wasn't really designed for that, and the province flipped out. It said, well, we've got global warming coming on, we better get used to this, we need to find ways to drastically increase the output. But understanding that they were reacting to the average increase in global temperature and maybe screwing that up a little bit. But nonetheless, reacting to that, they didn't want to just put more and more coal on. Not to mention the fact that, coal is bad to breathe in. So what they did was they put all kinds of money into my battery is low, so I'll be back in a sec. Okay, so yeah, it's about 2005. They just got nailed with a really hot summer. They're looking at forecasts that say we should get used to these really hot summers, and they need to find a way to increase capacity without destroying the climate or destroying the environment, anyways, destroying people's lungs. And so they put all kinds of money into the green environmental initiative. Now, there were a lot of parts of this that didn't work out the way they were supposed to. Some of it was shut down by the WTO. Some of it just didn't work out. But 10 years on, we, at the very least, succeeded in drastically increasing the capacity that we could create with. And we have also succeeded in one of the side goals, which was in creating an export industry. Although it didn't quite work out the way that was planned. So we wanted to be able to increase capacity, and we wanted to have an export industry, and that has succeeded. But something else did not happen. And that is that we didn't generate the same, we're not generating the demand that we had projected. Now, it's something I skipped over, and that's why why my brain froze there, was that, I pointed out that, they wanted to increase generation without destroying the planet, kind of thing. That's pretty obvious. I'm sorry, something just fell on me or something. So they wanted to increase capacity without exploding the Earth, but they were also counting on the transition to the transition off of carbon, right? It's like what drove the policy was the need to increase capacity because the capacity was, we were under generating at the time, but because liberal governments in Canada tend to overstudy things, they worked in the inevitability of the system requiring even more capacity for things like electric cars, right? Meaning that that's something that we should probably be pretty proud of. Our government had the foresight to realize that it was going to need to drastically increase capacity to deal with a carbon shift or a shift off of carbon. And it actually created the infrastructure. It did everything it needed to do in order to put the system in place so that people could shift off of fossil fuels and onto clean electric generation. So we have this huge grid now where we generate tons and tons of electricity. We generate more than we can use. But we haven't had demand catch up. Part of the reason why we haven't had demand catch up is because we haven't had the extreme hot weather that it seemed like we were going to have. We had a solar peak. We've had record hot years and everything, but we haven't had the heat waves if the last couple of summers have been um, kind of we've had warm falls, we've had late falls and early springs, but we haven't had really intense summers. So the demand hasn't caught up to what was projected. On top of that, we haven't had a transition. We set the system up to expect, mass movements to electric vehicles. That never happened, right? So the result is that we're creating way more electricity than we can use. And the way the system was set up, it was kind of a gamble that the government made. And you can look back on that and say in hindsight or whatever. But I mean, it's hard to criticize it as a policy decision. They made that gamble that it would be better to ensure that they had too much electricity than not enough. The short end of the long, complicated rant is just that the solution to get electricity prices down is that we just need to use the system as it was designed, and we need to do that anyways, right? But people aren't getting it. They're just complaining that the costs are up. People are saying they're going to switch to gas. This goes back to what I was saying before about how market incentives, it goes back to what I was saying about market theory, about how market theory doesn't work, and it goes back to what I was saying about how carbon taxes aren't going to work, because the whole homo economicus rational person basis is bunk, right? If people were rational, they would react to the situation the way that I'm reacting to it and say, okay, we need to use more electricity, but they're not rational, and they're not able to. You could say that they don't have perfect information. Well, I don't think we need to say they don't have perfect information. I think even if they had perfect information, they would make bad choices, because they're not able to. They're not able to analyze the information. They're not able. You can give them. I mean, in some sense, we have too much data, but we can't analyze it. We don't know what to do with it. We don't have the capabilities, right? Maybe some of us do, but broadly speaking, on average, in aggregate, we're talking about economics. So let's say in aggregate, human beings do not have the mental capabilities to analyze something even this simple. I mean, it could be simpler, right? It does require a little bit of thought to get your head around it, but it's not particularly complicated, right? If people were rational, they would say, okay, the grid exists, we need to get off carbon. If we do that, we'll decrease our costs, so let's do it. That's not what people are saying. What they're saying is that my immediate, and we can maybe Kahneman was onto something. Maybe it's the behavioral part of things, Maybe we don't need to talk about perfect information. Maybe we need to talk about short-term interests, right? And what it is that really drives people being, heuristics and rules of thumb, and the ability to analyze what's in your best interests now rather than what's in your best interest in the future. What they'll do is they'll say, well, okay, the price of electricity is this now, the price of gas is this now, so what I need to do is I need to take my electric heating out and put a gas furnace in, because I'll save a little bit of money this year. And I can't even do the calculation on when a rate of what the return on the investment is. Never mind the admittedly counterintuitive calculation that goes into saying that if I buy more, I spend less. Although you'd think that anybody that's been to a price club realizes that, right? I mean, it's just. I mean, everything's cheaper in bulk. right? Everything is. Doesn't matter what it is. You can think of it like that. That's an intuitive way to get the idea across. The more you buy, the less it costs, right? It's not quite right, but it's at least the right idea, right? But never mind that. Okay, you can't even get the idea of a rate of a return on your investment across, because you're going to spend a lot of money to take the electrical out, and you're going to spend a lot of money to put the gas in, and it's going to be 15 years before you get a return on that. You can't even see that, right? All you see is this is the difference in costs, and so therefore I'll save money on. Like, even that's wrong, and I know that people do that because my landlord did that. Not the goofy one, but the reasonable one did that. And I tried to explain to them that this is foolish, but they didn't listen. I think that they didn't do it down here, and I don't think they're going to change the furnace out down here. And I think it's because I convinced them otherwise. But I think the argument they convinced them had to do with the cold air in the basement, rather than the fact that, I believe he's in his late 60s. He'll be dead before he sees a dime on it. He will not live long enough to see a return on the investment. But he did it anyways. Because he was driven by short-term thinking, not, the homo economicus. Now, I don't want to say that I gave him perfect information, but I at least gave him a little bit of information. Still didn't make any difference. Even with perfect information, he still couldn't figure it out. Still went towards the short-term thinking, right? So this is a bit of a quandary, right? I think that the lesson is that if you want people to if you want to provide an incentive towards people on an economic level, you don't want to model them as rational beings, right? Whether they have perfect information or not, you still don't want to model them as rational. What you want to do is you want to incentivize them in terms of short-term interests. So you want to set it up in a situation where the cost of electricity is cheaper now. Unfortunately, all of the climate change economics are based on the idea that people will be smart enough to see that in the long run they save money. They won't see that. And I think it's really important that policymakers stop pretending that they will see it. They won't. And that's not just a cynical analysis. This is it's a field of economics nowadays. There's a lot of empirical study underlying this. It's not just a cynical, people are too stupid. No, this has been studied rigorously, and the actual facts of the matter are that people, or that, again, in aggregate on average, people will not make the choice that's in their best interests in the long run. They will work on intuition, heuristics, rules of thumb, and make what they think is in their best interest in the short term. And my anecdote is the perfect example of it. I saw the same thing with the carbon tax. People saying, people weren't saying that I'm going to use less gas. People said, well, I guess I'm going to have to take my kids out hockey, so that I can spend more money on gas. Same thing here. People aren't saying, well, I'm going to shift things out, I'm going to use more electricity because I know that. No. What they're saying is that I'm going to use less electricity. I'm going to change my entire heating system because the price of gas is less than the price of electricity in the short term. So policy needs to be crafted to ensure that when you're incentivizing people, you're incentivizing them in the short term. What does that mean? That means tax breaks on electric cars, and that means almost certainly in the short run, rebates on electricity. Because people cannot think rationally in the long run. People can only think in the short run. Maybe that's why we're stuck with capitalism, right? Maybe that's the whole human nature. Maybe we can teach kids, maybe it's a little bit of circular logic there. Maybe the reason we think in short term is because we're taught to think in this short term. But regardless, if we're taught to think in the short term, then in the short term, we need to do our policies so that they're focused on the short term. And let's not get stuck in recursion relations. Okay. I can have some fun with this. I'm a logician. I can screw you up. I'm not going to. I want to get a point across. Okay. And the point is that we need to be thinking policy in the short term. And that probably means rebates. And I know nobody likes that. Well, I think consumers would like that. But it's the way you gotta do it. If you want people to use more electricity, you have to find a way to decrease the costs in the short run. And then once you get them off, once you get them doing it, then, the system will kick in as it was intended, right? Once you get demand up, things will start working as intended, right? But they need that kick in the ass, and the kick in the ass has to be short-term incentives. Actually, you know what? I did see a policy. I can't remember what it was about, but I saw a policy paper from the Liberal Ontario government where it actually was implementing behavioral economics. So this is not outside the rubric. Again, I've said this a few times. The Liberals in Ontario, they're smart. They're very focused on education, very focused on academia, very focused on numbers and science and everything else like that, right? Liberals in Ontario are an empirical, science-based party. It's very refreshing. The Democrats really aren't. They might like to pretend they are, but when you really scratch the surface, it's all the same, goofy market theory and, Calvinist nonsense. Now, that stuff is very obscure in the Liberal Party in Canada. So, you can't have faith that if you can sit the right people down and you can say what I'm saying right now to them, they will listen, right? It's just a question of, getting it across to them. And, of course, because they're the Liberal Party, it's not just getting across to them, it's getting it across to them in a way that can benefit someone on Bay Street. But the short run, what I'm trying to get across here is that the policy was successful. Unfortunately, as consumers, we're not reacting the way we're supposed to. And, that part of the policy needs some tweaking. But we wanted lots and lots of generation, and we wanted lots and lots of generation done cleanly. That got done. Let's give the people that set that up a nice round of applause. But let's finish the job and let's get ourselves off carbon through an incentive system that's designed to do it.